For though we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not the weapons of the world. Instead, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We tear down arguments and every presumption set up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
V54 with the ego, yup. Big bad me moving to the left. I'm seeing bankroll, but I never stuck until he say so. Gotta kill my flesh. I'ma take a back seat, gotta decrease that sweet. That's cool with me.
Greetings, you are listening to Cantus Firmus. I'm Cody Cook, and my guests today are John Dangelo III and Aree Spivey. John was a former Marine deployed in Afghanistan, now the man behind antiwarwarvet.com. Aree is an artist behind Failed Kingdoms. You can find his singles on SoundCloud, Google Play, iTunes, Amazon, and Spotify. Probably something else too. Maybe YouTube?
Yeah, YouTube.
There you go. So I've asked you two legit anarchists here today to discuss one of the most off-cited biblical passages for defending the state. So this is anytime someone mentions this passage, it's always a shorthand for, hey, the state has its own role and prerogative. And it's the old old faithful, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So before I do that, though, I want to ask, what's up with you guys? What are you up? John, I know you've been doing some podcasts recently. Aree, what you doing?
Yeah, Fell Kingdoms actually has a podcast now, so we've been working on that. I think on August, and I've been promoting it a lot, but on August 6th we'll have Dr. Josh Rasmussen with his wife Rachel on the podcast to talk about their new book, When Heaven Invades Hell. And so we're just trying to get not as many people, but interesting people who have some form of a theological leaning towards what we believe to get on the podcast and just have good conversations. And we also have, not right now, but because we have the baby on the way, and Brian, who's the other half of Fell Kingdoms, he just had a baby. So it's kind of been a little slow trying to release music and do projects and music videos and whatnot. So as soon as we get a little bit more situated, then we'll start, doing a lot more with Fell Kingdoms in terms of music and even shows. And we actually can't even do shows right now because of COVID. But right now, that's where we are. We really been focusing on the Fell Kingdoms podcast, and that's on YouTube and whatnot. So,
and what kind of stuff do you guys talk about with the podcast?
We talk. I mean, I think it's been the fourth. I think we're on the fourth one. I haven't released the fourth one yet because I just finished editing it, and it's not just audio format, but it's also video, so it takes a little bit longer. We talk about anarchism. We talk about theology. We talk about culture, music. I think in the next one we're going to be talking about why the new Disney movie Artemis Fowl is so horrible. And so, yeah, we're going to be doing a movie review on that. So it's sort of we do everything, anything that comes to our mind, we'll take a crack at it on the podcast.
Cool.
That's
and
cool.
Now, John, so you've been on a few podcasts recently. You've also been doing some Instagram lives with the Anti-War Vet on Insta. Is that right?
Yeah. I've been trying to hit the podcast circuit a little harder now that my second son was born just 4 months ago, so things are a little bit more settled now. And I've been on Foreign Policy Focus a few times with Kyle Anzalone, twice pretty recently, and then I just did one of the podcasts with E-Militia, which was fun. And so, yeah, I've been working on a big project. I'm trying to do an ebook right now, working on the retrospective of the invasion of Iraq. So I'm trying to source it all together so that we have, as libertarians or as anti-war people, and it's nonpartisan, non-ideological, we have one single source we can go to and say, look, these are all the points to make the case that this was this was an illegal, unjust war, and that we were propagandized into it. Because I think, ultimately it ended up really changing the way that U.S. foreign policy looks, and precedent is everything. So I'd hate to see this sort of thing happen again. And we've seen inklings of it with Syria, and issues have come up already to justify more invasions, more atrocities based on chemical weapons or whatever. So I kind of want to have that out there as soon as possible. So once that's done, I'll start getting back to writing more frequently, hopefully.
Awesome. Yeah, and I've done a little bit of writing for Kindle and paperback on Amazon and stuff. So if you have any questions about trying to figure out those kind of hoops and whatever, let me know, and I'll be glad to help you.
Yeah, you're going to be my source for sure.
Awesome. Well, if you guys are cool to start it, let's start talking about render to Caesar.
Yes.
Cool. All right. So my plan was to go through verse by verse where this passage appears in Matthew 22. It's also in Mark 12 and Luke 20 in slightly different forms, and we can compare those when necessary, but I think Matthew 22 should be fine as our baseline. So we start here in verse 15, and we go all the way to verse 27. So verse 15 gives us the background here. So I assume most people are at least slightly familiar with this passage, but if you're not, it's okay. We'll jump into it. We're going to go through verse by verse. You'll kind of get what's going on. So verse 15 reads, "Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said." So him in the verse is Jesus, and the Pharisees are a group of Jewish leaders who are one of the antagonists of Jesus throughout the Gospels. So that's kind of the background on there. But so I've got kind of notes as I went through this, but if anybody wants to kind of comment as we go through, maybe I'll let you guys say something first as we read each verse, and then if there's anything I need to add to that, I'll kick it in. But so our first verse here is, "The Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said." Any comments?
This is such an important theme in the New Testament, and particularly about the interactions with Jesus, is the sort of established religious authority and how it interacts with Christianity. And I think it's I'm a big Bible Project fan, and they talk a lot about hyperlinks, right? So whenever they start talking about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, they're trying to clue you in immediately. All right, we're setting the stage here for this established sort of hierarchical religious group, and all of their problems that they've presented throughout the New Testament should kind of be overlaid as this event begins.
Cool. I was say real quick on the Bible Project, they're great. My daughter likes to watch the videos before she goes to bed at night.
Oh, cool.
The other day I was going through working on my Hebrew, and I kind of came across a word, and I said, okay, I think it was Rasha. And I said, I think that word means evil. And she was sitting next to me. I said, that means evil, right? She said, yeah, or wickedness.
That's so cool.
Aree, any comments?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say, the way that I was, obviously the modern and the most common way to understand this particular passage is to say that, Jesus is making a difference. And I hope I'm not getting ahead, but the whole point is that most people, when they read it, they will generally think that Jesus is saying, all right, pay your taxes to the government, and then, give to God what is his. But the way in which I was taught this specifically, and I'm glad that I learned this. I had a theology professor, and when I was in college, and he actually understands it as a polemic against Rome, and so that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from when in terms of my interpretation of this particular passage. So it's more so of a polemic than anything else.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing how that shakes out as we go forward.
Yeah.
So so the main thing that I had kind of noted when I got to this verse was There are some differences. So, for example, Luke doesn't specify the party that's involved. He doesn't mention the Pharisees specifically. Mark actually mentions the Pharisees and the Herodians, which is kind of odd because they would have been sort of antagonistic to each other. The Herodians supported the puppet king Herod, who worked under Rome's authority, and the Pharisees are more traditional. They were more patriotic. And so it seems like odd that they would work together on something, but that does sort of underline how much neither of them like Jesus. Was it the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Mm. One thing that though we're going to have to sort of clue into, and this first verse really sets the scene, is that the goal of the people who are interacting with Jesus here are trying to trap him. And that, I mean, and that term that's used is like a hunting term in Greek. It's usually applied to ensnaring a bird. So I think the question they're about to ask him, we kind of are already clued into the fact that it's going to be a trick question. They're trying to trap him in something. And so that does sort of set the scene for how we should be looking at what they ask. So that leads us to verse 16. The Pharisees sent their disciples to him. Actually, Matthew does mention the Herodians too, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any." And I only had one quick note here, is that it's obvious they're trying to butter Jesus up here. They're hoping that he will think that they're on his side, and they just want an honest answer because they think he's very wise. So they don't want him on the defensive because then he won't feel safe to speak his mind. They're trying to, we'll go into exactly how they're going to try to trap him, but the idea is they're buttering him up. We know they're trying to trap him, but they open with this real kind of, butt kissing line. Does anybody else have anything to add on that?
Nope.
The Pharisees, it's funny that they are so hand-handed with this, or seem to be, only because we already know, they just had back in Matthew, 21, they have the moment where the chief priests come up to Jesus and are questioning his authority and baptism on all this stuff with John. So it is interesting that they've appeared so two-faced so quickly in this gospel.
Yeah. So then we get to the question they ask here in verse 17. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? So that's the trap. The question assumes that there is a conflict between honoring the pagan Caesar who invaded God's land and the God who truly owned the land. So the trick or the trap is that they're going to get him in trouble with someone. Either the people who don't like Rome are going to be upset when Jesus says, yeah, we should definitely pay taxes to Caesar. Or on the other hand, Caesar is not going to tolerate a rebel. So if he says, no, we shouldn't be paying taxes to Caesar, then that he's in trouble with Caesar. So one way or another, they're hoping they're going to get him here. Either the people are going to lose respect for him, or he's going to end up on the wrong side of the state. Anything else to add?
That poll tax, just as some brief context, is like a special levy for subjects of Rome's domination. It's not like, here we pay our income tax or whatever. It's apart from citizens of Rome, meant simply for those in subjection to Rome, which I think is important for the overall story.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things that sort of stands out is, I went to or go to still a conservative Bible college and seminary, and they're politically conservative as well and patriotic, but so based, I don't know, there's kind of this complicated way that conservative Christians try to deal with this topic, where on the one hand they'll say render to Caesar, but on the other hand they also support like the American Revolution. So I think that's perhaps where the conflict actually is. Aree, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with John. I think it's important to understand what exactly the tax is, and what I understand it to be. This is just what I was taught, is that the specific text that they're referring to, it was actually a tribute, a form of a tribute text to show loyalty to Caesar.
Yeah. So, okay, so we move on then to verse 18, and we read, "But Jesus perceived their malice and said, 'Why are you testing me, you hypocrites?'" So the first thing I noted there is that despite their flattery, Jesus is perceiving the trap right away. And the word hypocrite, which is almost the same word in Greek, hypocritai, actually literally it referred to an actor on the stage, someone who wore a mask, But figuratively, it could be applied to anyone who pretends. So Jesus basically knows these guys are fake friends. They're not sincere with their flattery. They're not really truth seekers. So that's the first thing. He perceives their malice, and he calls them hypocrites. So he knows it's a trap. So the question is, how's he going to get out of it? Aw, John got baby. All right. So verse 19, "Show me the coin used for the poll tax," is what Jesus says. And they brought him a denarius. Okay. So the coin is going to be how he gets his rhetorical flourish here for dealing with this trick question. And I was going to mention just really quickly about the coin that's being used, and this will be borne out as it goes on. Well, according to Craig Keener, who wrote a socio-rhetorical commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, he said it was related directly to pagan Roman religion and to the imperial cult in the East. The side bearing his image also included a superscription, namely Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. The other side bore a feminine image and read Pontiff Maximus, referring to the high priest of the Roman religion. And the empire actively used such coins to promote the worship of the emperor. And while Jews were allowed to honor emperors, they were expected to avoid images. So that's just a little background on the coin. And as we go on, we'll sort of see that actually is borne out in the text itself. Any other thoughts about that?
Just to speak to the divinity a little bit, I think that this, I think it's really important that like today we've really lost that layer of rulers being explicitly divine or possessing some sort of like celestial providence. And I think,
are you sure about that? Because I've seen some Trump supporters who
yeah it certainly hasn't gone away completely, but like to see this this godlike image, I think is really helpful. And to your point, it's sort of our signal as Christians that there's a significant difference between our earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom, and this coin does such a good job of demonstrating that.
Yeah, well, because I mean, they're not wrong that there's a contradiction, right? Mm-hmm. But I guess the question is, have they escaped the contradiction, and is Jesus going to escape it? And that's I think what we're going to get into as we go forward. So, verse 20, he said to them about the coin, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" I'll have to probably read 21 here just to make it make sense. He said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So there's a question here that's never asked, but is always assumed. When I say here, I guess I mean in the interpretation of this text. Because Jesus says, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So the question is, what belongs to Caesar, and why does it belong to him? And also, what belongs to God, and why does it belong to him? Particularly with Caesar, is it the coin that belongs to Caesar, or is it his power because God gave it to him? So is it his coin because he made it, or is it his power because God gave it to him? And I think that the assumption that many people make when they read this passage is that it's not about the coin, it's about the power. And that Jesus is saying that they should respect Caesar's power because God has given Caesar this distinct realm which is his, the things that are Caesar's, which is distinct from the realm of God, where that has the things that are God's. So that's just kind of a big picture thing that we can get into as we try to dissect this. But I think that kind of lays out the choices that we have here as we are trying to understand this text. So I pulled up here R.T. France's International Greek Testament Commentary on Mark. And what he had said when he was looking at the belonging to Caesar thing, he said that what belonged to Caesar in this context was primarily the monetary obligation of the poll tax, though Jesus' words are broad enough to permit a more expansive understanding of civic responsibility as well. So he goes on to say that the second member of the pronouncement, and to God the things of God, is entirely open-ended and must be filled out by the reader's understanding of God's claim on his people. It will be that understanding which determines whether the claims of Caesar and of God come into conflict. But the way the pronouncement is formulated suggests that such conflict should be expected to be exceptional rather than normal. So France sees these two domains, one is holy, one is secular. Christians have distinct responsibilities to both, and he assumes that they will rarely come into conflict. So that's France's view, and I think he represents the kind of traditional understanding of the passage, that it's not about coins, it's about Caesar's domain, Caesar's God-given right to rule. Now, Craig Keener, who I don't think is like an anarchist or libertarian or anything, at least he hasn't expressed that, he reads it differently. So he argues that, well, the emperor is the one controlling the production of the coins, and they're officially his property. So I think that's a much simpler way of reading the passage, and I think it's more correct. And I guess I'll say why I think it's more correct. And you guys can break in at any point here and interrupt me, but I think as most people who read this passage do so, they treat it as if Jesus had answered a simple, why, yes. Should we pay the poll tax? Well, yeah, of course you should pay the poll tax to Caesar. That's how I think people understand Jesus to have answered. But that's actually not the case. He gave an answer that got beyond the question as it was being asked. He reframed the conversation entirely. And I think one thing that is sometimes hidden here is that when we use this kind of KJV, render unto Caesar, we lose a little bit of the meaning. Because render is not a word that we use very often, but in Greek, the word that's being used there means to give back. So the coin was Caesar's. He minted it, he introduced it into circulation, and he did so with the condition, a contract of those using it, that there would be a usage fee, a tax to be returned for its use. So Jesus is not saying to give to Caesar whatever Caesar asks. He's not saying that Caesar has a special domain to do what he pleases that God can't touch. It's really as simple as this. The coin belongs to Caesar. That coin belongs to Caesar. It's his. If he asks for it, give it back. How you doing, John?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's not good. Something about whenever I go into my office to record, the cats want in, and my daughter invariably will, at some point, just swing open the door. There's something that they just want to be in this room. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I'm doing my very best to to mitigate, but
Hey,
so the coin problem is really interesting. I like the and I've actually never heard that sort of exegesis before. I've always found that the idea of all things being God's domain and therefore all things are his, it was sort of his cheeky way of saying, like, yeah, you can give the coin to him, but let's not forget who the ultimate sort of author of life. Maybe that distinction is better illustrates kind of the point that Jesus is making, that and underlies like the property rights conversation that we were having.
Yeah. So I think that is what is kind of interesting about it as I revisited this passage, is that I sort of always assume that, because I think sometimes the way people frame something up the first time you hear it, you assume is the right way to frame it up. But really, I think people often present this as a trick question in basically the same way, like in a similar way that the Pharisees and the Herodians were, right? they frame it up in a certain way so that if you answer the question the way they're asking it, you lose. But I think ultimately, yeah, if you treat it about the coin, well, property, the world is God's, but we also have private property that God allows us to have, and this is Caesar's private property. So if you ask for it back, give it back. So yeah, so it's really about a right. He's really making a point about private property and the right to contract. And so he's not. I don't think he's saying then that Caesar or the state can lay claim to your life or go to war whenever he pleases. That's not what's being said.
But I think there's an element of willful submission here too, right? Like when we think back to his arrest in the garden, or to Romans 13, which is a common objection, this idea of willful submission to state authority, I think is an important element here, because they're asking under the premise that like this is the sword created authority that we live under, that we're subjected by, and go ahead and tell us how we're supposed to live under their dominion as faithful adherence to God's will. And I think that's all like wrapped up really interestingly here. Is it's not, I don't think it's simple enough to say it's merely a matter of the coin being Caesar's, because that coin represents so much of what I was just talking about. But I think that it does kind of make an interesting object lesson for it.
I would also I just want to add, I don't know if you guys are aware of the Old Testament scholar John Walton, or either Michael Heiser or Ben Stanhope.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you've read any of their material, you have to understand within ancient Near Eastern context, one of the things that the Israelites did was they regularly employed polemical speech within their writing. So if you specifically in Genesis 1, we in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But if you look at it within the broader ancient Near Eastern context, and I'm getting somewhere with this, but if you look at it and you look at something like the Enuma Elish, or a different creation narrative, what John Walton or these other ancient Near Eastern scholars, they will say that the thing that they're doing is that they are employing a lot of the writing in the Old Testament is clearly employed to polemicize the other cultures and the other pagan nations, regularly employing polemical speech to get their point across. And so I think this is just, and obviously the New Testament authors would know this, and they probably understood that this is what was happening in their ancestors' time. This is how they wrote. This is how they understood their scriptures. And so I think what's happening in terms of Jesus in this particular passage, I think Jesus he's alluding to specific speech in the Old Testament, specifically in terms of whose image. I think when he says whose image is on this, I think those Jews in the first century would have understood that Jesus is appealing to something in the Old Testament. And I think when he says whose image is on this, I think the Israelites would have understood that, Jesus is referring to something like Exodus, where it says that thou shalt worship the Lord your God and not make any graven image of him. So I think image in this particular context is referring to this image is referring to the worship of God. And so I think when Jesus said that, I think that the Israelites would have understood that, okay, he's talking about images, so he's talking about worship. So I think we have to look at it in terms of not only that particular context, but also look at it in terms of, because Jesus always alludes to the Old Testament. And so I think here, even in terms of inscription, I think it's actually coded language in terms of the Shema. So it says, Deuteronomy 6:4-6, it says, "Hear, O Lord, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts, or to be inscribed on your hearts, or to be written on your hearts." So I think what's actually going on is that when Jesus is speaking to the Israelites, he's actually asking rhetorical questions to them and saying, yo, when I say these words, you are going to understand that I'm alluding to specific passages and specific ways of thinking in context with the Old Testament. And so I think and even in terms of this inscription, it's referring to the worship of God. And so this is the reason why I would take the polemical view of these particular passages, because I don't even really think that Jesus is actually referring to I think what it is that the Israelites at that point, they were actually trying to get Jesus to, tackle that particular question that we understand it to be. But I think Jesus is just literally just turning it on its head, and he's actually showing them that what's really happening is that Caesar or Tiberius at that point, he's making a claim of godhood, of divinity, when you do this tax. And that's the reason why he employs, whose image or whose inscription is on this. And the Israelites would have understood, okay, he's probably referring to Old Testament. He's probably referring to some Old Testament passages. So they would have understood that. And so for me, it's literally Jesus making a claim. Jesus is saying or Tiberius at that point is making an exclusive claim of divinity. And also I would like to say that I think the inscription on the coin would most likely say, something like the worshipful son of God, Tiberius Caesar. I think it probably would have said something like that. And so, I can't remember what scholar I pulled that from. I can probably look it up later. Yeah. But
I mentioned that Keener had argued that the superscription would have said Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus.
Yes. So this is the reason why I think what Jesus is doing this is what he's trying to get out. Caesar makes a claim of Godhead, makes a claim of divinity. So does Yahweh. And though specifically money in that time, it had a connotation of worship. And so I think, getting down to the brass tacks of it, Jesus is clearly putting up a choice to the Israelites. Either this is what Caesar is saying: when you make this tax, or when you give this tribute, you are explicitly telling Tiberius that he is God. Or so if you do this, you are choosing to worship Caesar, and you are choosing to not worship Yahweh. So I think it's Jesus telling the Israelites that Caesar and Yahweh are making exclusive claims of divinity. When you give this tax, either you are giving it to Caesar and you are proclaiming Caesar's divinity, or the opposite, you are proclaiming Yahweh's divinity. You can't do both. So that's the way that I've understood it to be, to understand it.
And just to piggyback just for a moment, the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English lexicon, they actually define image by using of heathen gods, of painted pictures of men, or an image and likeness of God's making man in his own image. So that clear distinction there, I think, just to your point, would absolutely be something that the audience was aware of, almost necessarily based on their response.
Yeah, so I think Jesus is basically doing this. Jesus is doing what Elijah did on Mount Carmel. So he says, "Choose ye this day who you will serve." So hence, whoever you believe to be God is then the person you will worship. And one of the ways in which you worship is by giving tribute. And so if you believe Caesar to be God, then you worship him, and if you believe Yahweh to be God, then you worship him. So that's basically how I understand it. I don't even think Jesus actually answered exactly what the Israelites were trying to get him to answer. I think what he actually answered was, this is the way in which Caesar has set up this tax, this tribute, is idolatrous in nature. So you choose ye this day who you will serve, Israelites. And if it's Yahweh, then you worship Yahweh. And if it's Tiberius, then you worship Tiberius and you give the tribute.
The word there that used for image is icon. And it is, primarily used to describe pagan deities, like for example, the great image in Daniel 2 of presumably the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. We also see it in 1 Corinthians 11, that man is the image and glory of God. 2 Corinthians 4:4, Christ is the image of God. Colossians 1:15, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And Revelation 13:15, the image of the beast, which is worshipped. So that gives you a little bit of background on it. But let me sort of pull up my passages here. So on the note on polemic, there's another great book that you should check out by John Currid called Against the Gods. And his subtitle is The Polemical Theology of the Old Testament. And for those who aren't familiar, polemic is a kind of a written argument against something. And the argument that's being made by a lot of these Old Testament scholars is that the Old Testament writers will sometimes use imagery or language that they're borrowing from their theological opponents, for example, pagans, Babylonians, Egyptians, whatever, and they'll sort of turn it on its head. So you'll see that particularly with the creation narratives. You see it with the way the Psalms will use the poems about Baal, the Baal cycles, where Baal is the storm god who's described as riding on the clouds. And the psalmist uses that language and turns it on its head by applying it to Yahweh, and to try to suggest that Yahweh is superior to Baal. So there's the idea of the icon or icon used as a comparison to these false gods. But there's also the fact that human beings are, I guess it'd be icons of God, right? Mm-hmm. So Jesus, on one hand, is using this kind of very charged language, religious language, when he refers to the image on the coin, the icon, or icon, because it's supposed to bring to mind idolatry. But then, so that's the image on the coin. So the coin belongs to Caesar. It's got his image on it. So then the question is, well, what belongs to God? Because Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are, give back to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So if the thing that belongs to Caesar is the thing that has his image on it, then perhaps at least one of the things that belongs to God are the things that have his image on it. And so, what really Jesus, if you follow that logic, what Jesus would be saying then is Caesar does not have authority over human beings. He didn't create them. They're not in his image. He can't dispose of them or kill them or whatever, or use them however he pleases. He's got his coins. He minted those, but that's what he's got. He doesn't own you. He owns the coins. He's not God. And so, Tertullian looking at this passage says, that means render the image of Caesar, which is on the coin, to Caesar, and the image of God, which is imprinted on the person, to God. You give to Caesar only money, but to God give yourself. Augustine said, we are God's money, but we are like coins that have wandered away from the treasury. What was once stamped upon us has been worn down by our wandering. The one who restamps his image upon us is the one who first formed us. He himself seeks his own coin as Caesar sought his coin. It is in this sense that he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. To Caesar his coins, to God your very selves. Now, in addition, though, what else belongs to God is everything that exists, because Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. Job 41:11, whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So there's a pretty significant contrast here. And I think that the fact is, we never really ask the question, okay, well, what belongs to God? We assume what belongs to Caesar. And we assume that whatever Caesar claims to rule over belongs to him. And I think that is really the wrong way to understand this passage. Jesus is talking about the coin. And I think, going from there, if you want to try to expand that out and say, well, maybe there's other things that belong to Caesar. Well, you have to contrast that the things that belong to God. And so once you've done that, there's very little that belongs to Caesar apart from his private property that God has allowed him to have.
Yeah. And he's certainly making some real commentary about the people who are approaching him too, because Herod and the Pharisees both represent these very, to the author and to the reader of like early 1st, 2nd century Israel, they would really understand the gravity that these people groups carried when they're coming to him, representing both the sort of state religious relationship. And I think that there's a lot there about Christ making a commentary about their submission first and foremost to those powers of civil government or of religious, the incestuous religious state relationship, and how quickly they've come to be like the bidders of Rome, this very heavy-handed, tyrannical power that just conquered Israel. Yeah.
So we basically have one verse left here in this passage, which is, hearing this, they were amazed, and leaving him, they went away. So they don't think he said yes. They think he said something else entirely that they didn't expect, and they're amazed. So you say something, John?
Yeah, no, I just absolutely, like, that just speaks to everything we're saying here, that he confounded them with his answer, because he's saying so very much with just one sentence. And that's the fun part about teasing out the Bibles and Jesus's teachings overall. But here, I think he's making so much social commentary that can still apply to us as contemporary Christians.
Yeah, you can tell that specifically in the last, like, I don't see how anyone can read the passage and then they say, okay, well, you should just, it's appropriate to, because the way in which the Israelites came in asking, it's almost as if they concurred with the question before they even asked it. So they were expecting him, because obviously within context, there's just, either Jesus says no, and then he's going to be seen as a rebel, or if Jesus says yes, and he's going to be seen as, as a person who values Caesar, who values the emperor over Yahweh, and all these different type of things. So it's just like he just pulls a 180, and he says he answers it a way in which they didn't even expect, and so it's like. Yeah, so this is the reason why I think the polemical interpretation is probably a better fit, because they just walked away and they were just dumbfounded about it. So I think the very fact that Jesus, in terms of the polemical interpretation, to say that Jesus is basically telling them that to give this particular tribute to Caesar is indeed a lapse in your worship to Yahweh, and it's actually worship to Caesar. I think that makes a lot more sense within the context when they just walk away dumbfounded, as if like, okay, wow, I didn't expect that answer.
Oh, I don't know. Can I push back on you a little bit, Aree?
Yeah.
I don't know that he is saying that it's worshiping to give the tax. I think what he's saying is kind of like what we pull out of Romans 13, this idea of willful submission, but overall understanding. And I think if he were to just turn the question around and ask the Pharisees, they would say, yes, you should pay the tax, because they are not the upstart revolutionaries that Jesus is and represented. And so I think Jesus is kind of playing both sides really cleverly by saying, yeah, you should pay the tax. You know, we don't want to start a bloody revolution against the Romans. However, let's not forget that there is far more that we as God-fearing men are called to be doing, and that our direction should be, you know, towards advancing the heavenly kingdom, not the ones of this earth. And so if that means living peaceably among this regime, then fine. But I don't think he's saying that it's worshiping Caesar to pay the tax so much as he's saying the Pharisees, represent more of a worship towards Rome because they've lost sight of their godly nature or professed godly nature.
Yeah. So I don't know if I would disagree with that per se, but where I was coming from, if when I was talking about when Jesus asked, whose image is on this? Whose image is on this coin? And then he says, what inscription is on this coin? And so I think what Jesus was doing there is making allusions to particular context in the Old Testament, specifically like Exodus 5, or even the Shema, and, you know, where Jesus is saying, and specifically in the Shema, he's saying where this will be, and this will be on your heart, so it will be inscribed on your heart, so it will be engraved on your heart. So I think what's happening there in this particular passage is that Jesus, and I think the Israelites would have understood this, and I think this is the reason why they left. Why they left and they didn't say anything after. It's because Jesus, when he's alluding to these particular passages in the Old Testament, he's showing them that specifically in terms of Exodus, where honor the Lord thy God, and not have any and not make any graven images of me, of him, and things of that nature. I think what's happening is that he's showing that within this particular context, that when you look at the coin, and when you look at what the coin stands for, when you look at what the coin probably had engraved on it, but it probably said, "Worshipful Tiberius, son of God," or something like that. I think what Jesus is trying to get them to understand is that this particular tribute, and this is why I think it's a polemic. I don't even think Jesus was trying to say anything about whether or not you should actually give it to Caesar or not. So I think the polemic is charged towards Rome itself, where Rome or Tiberius has a claim on divinity, where he is the Son of God. And if you know what the Son of God is, it's not a claim of, you know, humanity, it's a claim of divinity. And so I think what's going on there is that Yahweh has made a claim, an exclusive claim of divinity, and so has Tiberius has made a claim of divinity. And so I think what Jesus is saying, okay, now this coin signifies worship of Tiberius. And if not necessarily, I'm not even making the case, I'm not even making an argument that Jesus is saying not to necessarily pay it. I just think that's not really I just don't think that's his point. I think, this is where I would agree with you, John, where it's the Israelites' attitude towards Rome, where it's almost a worshipful tone for Rome. And so I think what Jesus is doing is that he's saying, you see what this coin symbolizes, and you see what this coin symbolizes, which is the divinity of Tiberius. And you know that Yahweh also makes a claim of divinity. So I think within the passage, Jesus is clearly making an effort to force them to make a choice, because obviously they're being They're being hypocritical, and they're probably they probably like Rome way too much than they should, and it probably is verging on worship. And so I think what's happening here is that Jesus is pitting a choice towards the Israelites. Either you choose to worship Rome or you choose to worship Yahweh. So I'm not even making the argument that Jesus is saying that you shouldn't or you should not pay the tax. I'm just saying that that's not really Jesus's point. And then I would supplement that with Romans 13, where we probably should just pay a tax just out of sheer passivity for the government. So I just don't think that this particular passage is even hinting at like recognizing any type of legitimacy for Rome or recognizing Caesar's property or anything like that. I think the whole point is that Jesus is putting a choice to the Israelites at that point. Either you worship Caesar or you worship Yahweh. So that's what I think this particular passage is talking about.
So I don't know that Jesus is necessarily offering that choice directly.
It's probably implicit.
Well, so in particular, he doesn't say what is the superscription. He says whose superscription is it. Mm-hmm. So I think that suggests that he's primarily concerned with who the coin belongs to. So that's one. But there is a challenge that he's giving to the Jewish people because his Jewish opponents, particularly, because they would normally have argued that holding a coin with the image of Caesar and those words that we described would have been idolatry. So whether or not Jesus thinks it was idolatry is beside the point. They do, and they still have the coin. So, he has not embarrassed himself. He's embarrassed them. They, not he, as Keener says, are carrying the offensive coin. So scruples against it cannot be their own. They have lost their ability to offer an objection. Now, I think if you focus on the coin and not on Caesar's alleged authority, I think one question does emerge, which is, if you didn't use Caesar's coin, would you be obligated to pay the tax? And so there's another passage I think we could talk about briefly, maybe it's just a couple verses long, in Matthew 17, the story with the fish and the coin in the mouth. But just looking at this one, it seems to me that to try to turn it into a story about what Jesus' opinion on taxation or the role of government or how much leeway Caesar has. Well, maybe that last one a little bit, because he does contrast what's Caesar's and what's God's, right? But I think to try to say that, well, what Jesus is saying is that we should pay taxes because Caesar deserves them is not really the point. I also don't know that his direct point is really that it's idolatrous to have the coin, but he is pointing out the hypocrisy of people who do think it's idolatrous to have the coin, and yet they still have the coin. But for example, if we decided to become, agorists and just trade, or, if we just use Bitcoin for all of our purchases, would we then be obligated to pay taxes since we're not using Caesar's currency? That's a question for whoever wants to answer.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think being a faithful Christian anarchist, I would say yes. And I try to live as much as I possibly can as an agorist myself. But, I'm not using Bitcoin for all my purchases or any of that. But the
How
idea.
About gold? Are you a Glenn Beck listener? Do you have a lot of gold stockpiled somewhere?
I do have some metal. Yeah. It's right next to my 45 that I don't want to use on anybody.
And also, do you have like vats of like food that will survive the apocalypse?
Not yet, but I'm working on it. Once we get settled in my next spot, I'm hoping to get a little prepping in. But I think that there is something really important about being a faithful Christian and interacting with government peaceably, right? We can't be government dissidents as Christians that raise up arms against them. And I think the ultimate reason why is because government is the institution that's created by the sword, right? And so we have to therefore put our faith in God and in his will and his ultimate ends, and trust that, we'll be delivered, and that these things will, whatever strife we face will be used for the ultimate good of God's kingdom on earth and the heavenly kingdom. So I guess to answer your question directly, yes, I think that we should still be paying our taxes, and not because we think that they're legitimate or that they're owed or that they're used for good purposes, so much as because it's a statement of our submission for the ultimate glory of God.
Yeah, I think that that's reasonable. So I don't know that this passage teaches that. So if all we had in the Bible on the subject was that passage, I don't think that the passage suggests that Caesar is owed our taxes. just that he's owed his coin, because it belongs to him. But if we were to look at another passage, like the one with the story of the coin in the fish's mouth, which I'll read it really quickly. When it's Matthew 17:24-27, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers?" When Peter said, "From strangers," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me." So, on this passage, we actually have a specific answer to the question of taxation. But before Jesus says to pay it, he tells you 2 other things. One thing is that he notes that taxation is inherently unfair. It almost always exempts certain people who are close to power. The second thing is the tax is for the temple. So this is not necessarily a Caesar. But if God is the king and Jesus is the son of God, he would be excluded from the tax. Since we become sons of God due to our relationship with Jesus, we're in the family of God and should also be excluded from taxation. We're not part of these other kingdoms. We're under a different kingdom. And so that's 2. 3, the reason that so ultimately Jesus is saying, you actually, they aren't owed any tax from you. And the whole way they do it is basically illegitimate. That being said, he says to do it anyway. And the reason he says to do it is to avoid causing offense. So it seems to me that the answer to the question is, yes, we should pay taxes, but not because Caesar is owed them. We should do it because we are trying to avoid unnecessary offense and fight battles that are far less significant than the spiritual battles that we're actually trying to fight. At least that's how I would understand that as kind of a corollary to this other passage.
So would you okay, let's just say you the vast majority, no, all of your money, all the money that you make, all your income is based in Bitcoin, which is not necessarily a currency that, the United States got. There's no image of Caesar written on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So would you pay taxes on your Bitcoin?
Would I personally?
Yeah, I mean, because I don't know. I mean, I think what John said is it's fine. But let's just say if the vast majority, like, my income is not based off of like U.S. currency at all, and let's just say it's based off of stocks or something like that.
Okay.
And I managed to get rich off of having a buttload of stocks. And so would I be obligated to actually like pay some form of a tax based off of my income? So if it doesn't belong to the government?
The state would say yes. In fact, they're taxing Bitcoin now. So the state would say yes. Now, I think if you're following the logic of render to Caesar, I would say, no, you're not obligated, just following that logic. But I think if you were to go to this other passage about the coin in the fish's mouth, Jesus' answer is, well, I mean, logically, it doesn't belong to Caesar. He's not really owed it, and the way he collects it is illegitimate and unfair, but you should probably just go ahead and do it anyway because it removes a stumbling block. And so Keener says that it's a stumbling block because it addresses one's own rights rather than the truth of God's kingdom. Alexandra Christianopoulos, I think is how you pronounce his name, who wrote a volume, Christian Anarchism, that collects, kind of goes through all these Christian anarchist views and figures. He argues that the questions like the payment of taxes are adiaphora, which means that they're indifferent in comparison to the one choice that really counts, the choice of God above Caesar. Eller, another Christian anarchist, says, let Caesar take his cut so that you can continue to ignore him. So, I would say that Caesar isn't owed anything. To take a passage like render to Caesar and say, well, this legitimizes Caesar's domain, misses the point. But the question is, should we still pay to Caesar anyway? Yeah, we probably should. Not because he deserves it, not because he's owed it, but because as Christians we have more important battles to fight. But at the end of the day, though, as the charge that's leveled in Acts 17:6-7 against Christians is, these are the men who are turning the world upside down, and they're defying Caesar's decree, saying there's another king named Jesus. And so, if Jesus is a king, then Caesar isn't. And I think that leads us to the question, well, how should we behave towards Caesar since we're opposed to his authority and he's not our king? We are sons of a different king, as Jesus says in that fish passage. So, for example, when we're looking at Caesar, if we're not under his authority, should we behave as belligerent? Should we look to overthrow him with violence? Jesus says no in John 18:36 because his kingdom isn't an earthly one that's defended by violence. So we fight our battle with spiritual weapons because it's a spiritual battle. Behind Caesar are these other spiritual powers, and they're the ones that we really need to be taking aim at. I think what maybe Jesus is really saying is the gospel is already offensive to a world under the authority of Caesar and Satan, so don't add more offense to it than necessary. So, voting, protesting, paying tax for office, whatever. But don't think for a second that any of that stuff is how we bring about the kingdom of God, and don't keep your eyes off the prize or forget what your highest allegiance is. At the end of the day, if you want to pay Caesar taxes, pay Caesar taxes, but don't take his argument seriously that he has a domain that God can't touch.
Well, so again, I don't know. I think ultimately, I think we're all on the same page except for that one distinction, the idea of, yes, we absolutely are paying it with the understanding that it's not legitimate and that it's really only to sate the thirst of the state, and that's unjust but necessary. But I don't think that it's really an option. I think the idea of the ultimate submission to the earthly kingdom, whatever that looks like outside of, it doesn't mean that we have to grab a gun, to join the military, to participate in genocide, anything like that. But it does mean that the edict set forth for us in whatever government structure that we find ourselves in, we have to obey for the sake of ultimate progress for the kingdom of God.
Unless it directly contradicts something that Jesus has commanded us to do, is what
absolutely, yeah.
So,
but that the tax is, so just to Aree's point, I'm sorry to interrupt you. To Aree's point, yeah, you're paying your 50% tax on socks or whatever it is, because that means that we are able to live another day fighting for the ultimate good.
Yeah,
would be my answer and my understanding of this. And I think you can derive a little bit of that out of the Matthew 22 verse we're talking about. But I don't think, to everybody's point, I don't think that that's necessarily the greatest point he's making. But I do think that that's definitely wrapped up in all of that, is an understanding of how we are to relate to civil government.
Yeah. And there's never a place in Scripture where Paul or Jesus lay out what kind of a state Christians should try to create, or how we should vote, or whatever. And I think it's sort of because they're just assuming that we're going to be in this world where other things, these other spiritual powers are in charge, and at least on the political level, and that we have to sort of bide our time. No, I think that doesn't mean that there aren't issues or causes or concerns that we can't get behind. But at the end of the day, that's not really the battle that we need to be fighting, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is really, I think it's easy for us to say, no, you got to pay the tax and just submit because this state is inconvenient and unjust, but doesn't negatively affect us. This is being said to Christians, early first century Christians who were being thrown into the Colosseum. So they understood the violent and unjust nature of government far better than we do from a lived experience, and they were still understanding it to mean willful, peaceful submission is the single best way that God will overcome the violent, unjust spirits of this world.
Yeah, well, I was saying the people that Jesus is speaking to are not being thrown in the Colosseum yet, but they are Jews who have lived through Roman occupation by pagans who,
Right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say them, but like the people who will be reading.
But the immediately following, that's definitely the case. All right. Aree, well, we've kind of been through the passage. Do we have any kind of concluding thoughts? It sounds like we're mostly in agreement, but we have some disagreements about some of these little issues about how do you follow through on some of these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a question. I want to see. I don't know exactly how you guys would handle it, but sure, I would agree that for the most part we should submit to the government, and if it tells us to go 25 miles per hour, you probably shouldn't go 40 miles per hour, and you should pay your taxes to in order to not offend them. But I think the question is, and I think it's because it'll just hit home because I'm black, but I married a Mexican. Mm-hmm. And some of her family, they're Christians, but they are illegal. And I don't really know how to deal with that because, okay, what should they do in terms of? And I know this kind of, I mean, it's not a tangent, but it really is something, specifically even like either as a Christian libertarian or as a Christian anarchist, I don't know how to quite deal with it or answer it. But if we are to submit to the government, I think I actually asked you this before, Cody. I think I did. How exactly are those Christians who are caught up in those particular situations? How are they supposed to deal with the very fact that they came here because they came here to get a better life? It really is an oppressive system over there in Mexico, but the governing authority that they now have to submit themselves under because they are in an occupied state. How are those Christians who are in those situations, how are they supposed to deal with the government if the government is directly telling them that they are to be deported and shipped back to their home countries? Because it seems to me that, like, if you are to submit to your government or to submit to government in general, that you should generally follow the laws that it has. So should those Christians self-deport back just to honor the demands and decrees of this particular state? Or I just don't get how to parse that through properly.
If I can take a crack at it, Cody, I'm sure you have something far more insightful, but I would say no, your family isn't obligated to self-deport or go back to Mexico. I do think that there's a fine line between this and immigration, particularly like Central South American immigration into the U.S. is a very new and interesting challenge to this question that I think probably deserves some scholarship. But I would say that I don't think that they're obligated not to live here, or that they can't live here because they didn't do it by the letter of the law. But I would still say that, like, if they were, if ICE showed up at the door, like, yeah, don't grab a 12 gauge and make your stand. I think if you're living peaceably amongst the nations, however that looks. I don't think that and again, just to make it the reductio ad absurdum example, yeah, it's not to say that in a Nazi-run Germany, you're obligated to weed out the Jews from the ghettos because that's the letter of the law. I think that there's a distinction between active support versus submission. Like, and Christ's entire ministry on earth was subversive and challenged the preconceived notions of people and the structures of authority that we still face ultimately. But I don't think that they have an obligation to adhere to immigration law so much as they do to live peaceably amongst the nations and men wherever they find themselves. And so if the US were to devolve into some different society than we are faced with right now, and we all fled, I don't think that we would be wrong as, asylum seekers in some sense, whether legal or otherwise, to try to find a niche wherever we end up. But I do think that we would be obligated to play along with the system that we find ourselves in as best as possible, with the ultimate understanding that like this, our authority or our subservience to the state's authority is not our goal. Like, we're not living our lives to make our government happy. We're just as that quote from, was it Keener, had said, like, to have the state leave us alone. Like, we want to be left to our own worship of Jesus and the functions we have as Christians to serve our call.
Yeah, because I mean, before you respond, Cody, the reason why I ask is because, like, okay, I'll have, obviously you have those really, like those Christian anarchists whose, like, their anarchism isn't really predicated on scripture, but it's like more so predicated on like the non-aggression principle. And so, like, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, like paying tax, like we should probably pay taxes. We should, more or less just get out of the government's way to do what it wants, I guess. But then you have those Christian anarchists who will literally tell you they're basically like secularist anarchists, and they will tell you straight up, okay, well, you don't have to pay taxes if you don't want to. Hey, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. And so, but when I'm in these kinds of conversations, the way in which anarchists and even Christian libertarians, or whatever you want to call them, they'll general, and I actually agree with it, but I just don't understand how to put it in practice. But we'll say, well, generally we need to submit to what the government says, and in order for it to leave us alone. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, I agree, but then you'll have the people on the other side who are like, yo, Romans 13, it legitimizes almost everything the government does, and then in terms of render unto Caesar, it legitimizes government, and because of that, it legitimizes the borders that the government has, and it legitimizes the authority that the government and the right that the government has to whether or not to restrict travel into its borders, or to stuff like that. And it almost seems like Christian anarchists and Christian statists, specifically on the right, I guess you would call it, we will, for the most part, come in and we'll agree that, like, at the very minimum, we should do what the government tells us to do, unless it restricts, unless it conflicts with something morally that Jesus told us to do, like not murdering people and stuff like that. So, but it just sort of gets a little foggy in terms of this because I have to deal with it myself because I have family members. So for me, I don't see a clear cut, through line between what we should do generally in terms of what the government tells us to do and what we should not do. If you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and I just I think that part of this too pulls into like how much are we animated by our interest in following scripture versus how much are we animated by our interest in like our disinterest in government in the state. And so we don't have to be happy about these laws or the way that we are, the society that we find ourselves in. I just think that it's a matter of understanding the tangible outcomes of what that looks like, the tangible manifestations of our faith relative to the state.
So what I would say is that arbitrary immigration laws are illegitimate and immoral. So from a logical and moral vantage point, they should be repealed. I think that would actually be a worthy cause for Christian political activism. I think people have an obligation to their families to care for them, and they also have an inherent right to move and travel. But on the other hand, if one can obey a law without denying Christian imperatives or taking on a burden that they can't carry, I think they should try, but only because they should try to avoid causing unnecessary offense. So, like you think about the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, I think the Gentiles were told to abstain from meat from strangled animals. And not because there was anything wrong necessarily with eating meat from strangled animals, but because they didn't want to, they wanted to avoid offending Jewish Christians, right? And so I would say we're not under the law. So we're under the law of God. We're not under the laws of man. So I guess my answer would be, from a logical and kind of moral, big picture vantage point, they're not doing anything wrong. But if it's possible to avoid causing offense, I think you should always try it if it's a possibility. Does that kind of make sense?
I mean, I just don't see how I get it. I get what you're saying, and it's like I guess I agree. But okay, when you say if it's possible to avoid offense,
mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how that translates over into the real world. Okay, what do you do? Yeah. In terms of, you feel what I'm trying to say?
No, I do. So, I think there are clear examples where Christians are told to disobey the state. But ultimately the reason, big picture, what we should avoid doing is disobeying Jesus, or if you're not a Christian, at the very least, you should try to follow like natural law, like you should respect other people's, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think our immigration laws actually violate those rights. And so I think, from a higher level perspective, like Jesus, I think, was basically saying with the coin in the fish's mouth, well, you're not obligated to give these guys anything. You are not under their kingdom. You're under a different authority. But he also says, but, we don't want to cause unnecessary offense. We don't want to kind of make a name for ourselves as people who are always trying to be rebellious or whatever. So go ahead and pay it. And so I think what I would say is that there's a higher calling and a higher morality, but sometimes you do things basically to be polite, to be considerate of other people, and to avoid unnecessary conflict. And so I think that is kind of where Jesus sort of comes in on this. So I guess the way I would look at it, I don't think that those relatives have done anything wrong. If they had said, the law says this, and, so we're going to respect that, I think that would have been a very respectable position for them to have. Not because the law was inherently good, but because they wanted to try to be respectful. I guess my biggest concern is they're here now, and the state is going to wrongly want to persecute them for that. And so I mostly be interested in trying to get those kinds of bogus laws repealed so that people don't have to make a choice between taking care of their family and obeying a bullshit law. That's, so that's what I would like to see change, because I don't think that Jesus has given us a clear black and white on this. I mean, I think there are these big important issues of right to travel, right to move, right to work, right to take care of your family, the pursuit of happiness, which is enshrined in our Constitution. And so, I mean, you could argue even from that vantage point, like when Paul was arrested and flogged, he said, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't do this. Your laws say that you can't do this. And so, I mean, if they wanted to appeal to the Constitution, for example, and say, hey, we've got a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and these immigration laws violate those rights, I think that would not be an illegitimate argument. But I think the desire to not cause offense is not the highest moral imperative. I think it's something that you should try to do whenever you can. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't understand why you're not an anarchist, because that sounds exactly like how we would argue. So
yeah, I guess so I go back and forth. I've got complicated feelings on that subject. Yeah, I mean, I guess that is kind of an anarchist argument. What is it? Luther had said that we should have the state not for Christians but for other people. And on one level, that is maybe what's happening a little bit. God has allowed the state to grow up to manage behavior of people who are not moral, who aren't interested in following moral guidelines. And so the state is this very imperfect solution that's managed by lesser divinities that are corrupt. And that ultimately Jesus is trying to pull people out from that, right? And he's trying to bring them into the kingdom of God instead. Man, John is really interesting to watch right now.
I know.
So, Jesus has kind of preemptively defeated those powers and principalities that are connected with the state, but they're still there. And so I think it's almost kind of like, it's like, you remember when you were a kid and you would have to like visit like a friend's house, and like, his parents might have different rules that didn't really make sense to you. And you wouldn't have had to follow those rules when you were home, but while you're at your friend's house, maybe you do to be polite, right? I think it's a little bit like that. Like we are kind of in this house of demons, and and I think we're seeking to be polite even as we are ultimately trying to subvert what it is that is happening here. And I think it's a very difficult line to walk. But at the end of the day, I guess the reason why I'm not an anarchist is because I'm not necessarily in favor of anarchist activism. I'm not necessarily like, hey, we need to fight to overthrow the state. I sort of go, I guess there's a place for it in God's providence, but it's just, it's also corrupt, and we just, it's like difficult to tiptoe around that, and but you have to, I guess, try to be respectful. But if that conflicts with following Jesus, then you follow Jesus every time.
Well, I would have a question about that. So, because the way that I see anarchism is, that's the ideal, and just like people not being enslaved. Obviously, there's still people who are enslaved. People not being enslaved is the ideal, and people are probably always going to be like, there's probably going to always be some form of slavery, through all of human history, maybe. So I think the way in which I see anarchism or an anarchist society is that it's clear, is literally the only thing that's stopped, like for me, the only thing that stopped me from becoming an anarchist was the very fact that I thought that the state was just an inevitable reality. That's just how I understood the state. And so for me, I think the one thing that tipped me over to anarchism was the very fact that you can, and I don't even think it's biblically related. I just thought, okay, well, it seems like a stateless society is possible, and all the services that the state currently provides, like defense, national defense, can be provided on a private level. And so that's the reason why. And I wouldn't even say that I'm an activist for anarchism per se. I just say that I'm a person who just states what they believe. If you feel me, because I wouldn't call myself an activist in terms of anarchism. I'll just say, look, slavery's wrong. It shouldn't be here. It probably won't ever leave. But at the same time, that doesn't throw away the very fact that the ideal is to not have slavery anymore. So that's the way that I understand anarchism.
Yeah, I keep thinking about it as you're talking, Paul's letter to Philemon. And, in this letter is this, all the kind of philosophical groundwork for the overthrow of slavery, but he still doesn't go, all right, so let's get to it. and I think Paul is recognizing that there's often very little that can be done. Christians are sort of stuck where they're stuck. The state is what it is. The culture is what it is. And you can live outside of that. You can provide a different model, but you can't use the tools of the state. You can't use violence to enforce anything. So I think that the tough thing is wherever we are, you almost have to bloom where you're planted, wherever you are in history and geographically, you have to seek to serve Christ the best you can. And I think that's why the Bible is not very the New Testament in particular is not very interested in answering political questions, because the answer is, well, you're part of a different kingdom, so you act like it. And as far as everybody else around you, there's only so much you can do about that.
Yeah, and to the idea of Christian anarchism, at least my view of it is that whatever I believe, I'm not taking this line or sort of assuming this ideology with the hopes that I'm going to someday implement it. If I had a button to push, maybe I would, but I think my understanding as particularly a Christian is that I don't really need to use the state as a change agent one way or the other, and that I am going to exist in this world regardless as a Christian first. And so, if I have to go out and cast a vote, I don't know, for me, that's not valuable, but for whomever, go ahead and do that. You can live within the confines of the society you find yourself in. But ultimately, I take the Matthew 22 image bearer aspect of my life extremely seriously. And so that's what I'm trying to really live out. It's not, it's funny, I have a constant conflict with my interest in political philosophy, because I almost feel as if it's like a hobby that isn't serving the purposes that I want to be serving, which is to serve God's kingdom. But I think that I can help Christians understand this extremely important nuance about the state and faith and faith adherence.
Yeah, I know what you mean about the complicated feelings about being interested in politics when you don't believe in it. And you don't necessarily think it's that effective, but
right, yeah. Right.
Well, do we want to kind of wrap up? Do we have any kind of parting shots, parting thoughts? Do you kind of feel like we sort of answered your question, Aree? I know it's a tough one. I guess the problem is I don't know if there's a super concrete answer, because Jesus kind of gives us this kind of complicated approach to it.
Yeah, I think it's answered. Obviously, man. It's just a very complicated thing to navigate through. So, yeah. I'm still a little unsettled about, by that whole situation. But I think I'm more or less okay with the answers that you guys provided. So I really appreciate it.
Okay.
For us particularly too, as Christian anarchists, like whatever an illegal immigrant is doing, the nationalist Christian would say, well, they're they're going to affect the welfare state. They have bad intentions in coming here. They're going to take our jobs or whatever. Like, that really isn't of interest to me. However, I do think that there's something to be said about like the intention of the given person, right? So like, assuming your family has good intentions or are Christians or whatever, like if they're living opposed to the state, but ultimately in line with Christ, I don't care. And that's, I think, the same thing that Paul or Jesus would have been saying is like, yeah, you don't have to obey the law. You're obeying it when like the audit gets pulled. Are you on the right side of this? Or are you going to end up getting executed? And is your execution going to serve like some greater purpose as a martyr, or are you just like kind of being foolish? Which I think, is something that we need to think about. Like, I'm not interested in following the law because I care about the law or its authority or its legitimacy. I follow the law because I don't want to end up, leaving fatherless kids or whatever.
Yeah, that's legit. I guess maybe if I were to simplify, I would say that it's conscience has a role here, right? I mean, I think maybe sometimes Jesus doesn't give us a hard and fast answer because a lot of times the answer, it would be hard to give one answer that would work for every situation. But I think we need to sort of keep in mind our obligations to our family, the rights that we have, and then the question, well, do you, if you still want to try to be respectful of the state and the law, how much does your conscience compel you to do so when you take into account all these other factors? So anyway, yeah, so I think the role of conscience has to come in a little bit.
Aree, we should do a long piece on fleshing this out. We could all work on it together.
Yes, absolutely.
Because immigration, I think, is singularly challenging because of all the various factors and objections and variables. But I think ultimately, none of us here are interested in the law and imposing it. It's more about like what kind of challenges it creates for us as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I haven't really done a lot of work on this, but I want to now that we've talked about it. And I mentioned conscience. I thought about Romans 13, where Paul says that we should be in subjection for the sake of conscience, subjection to the state for the sake of conscience. I'd be interested in trying to get a sense of what he might have meant by that, and if there are other texts that could give us some indication. But that at the very least suggests to me that that there is that role for kind of voluntarily thinking through it and making a decision for yourself based on trying to do what you think is the right thing in that circumstance. Paul does use that word too in 1 Corinthians 10:25. Eat anything that's sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. He's dealing with this question of eating meat sacrificed to idols. So I'm interested in seeing where how Paul uses that word generally, and if that can inform how he might be using it in Romans 13. But well, actually, I like how he uses it in 1 Corinthians 10:29. Why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? And then he goes on to say in verse 30, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do for the glory of God. So maybe that's another comparison we could make. I mentioned the issue of the Jewish Christians in Acts 15 who are have these complicated feelings about Gentiles not obeying these Jewish imperatives. And so the council in Jerusalem says, okay, just do a few things to make the Jewish Christians feel better, and that should do it. We're not going to make you get circumcised. That's crazy. But, there may be a few things you could do. And I guess that's kind of where maybe this comes in. It does become an issue of conscience.
Yeah, I think we need to do a long form discussion on that.
All right. Well, let's plan it. We don't have to do it right now, but let's maybe something we can be working on and putting some notes together. And we've got a Facebook chat going on, so we can maybe be popping things in there. And then when we're ready, that'll be one of the next ones we do.
Yeah, I agree.
Sounds great. It was awesome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you making the time, and it was tough to get together a little bit, but it's awesome when we can do it.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thanks, Anarchist.